Welcome, everybody, to Learning with Lowell. Today, we're joined with Erik McLaren. He is the host of Religious Wars, which I've checked out. It's a newish podcast. If you like hardcore history, if you like history of Rome, you're going to want to check that out. He's a journalist who's been on Vice, The Torontoist, TechVIBES, and Herb. Erik, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
In one of your recent ones, The American Jihad, which tells the story of Tecumseh and that period of time in Native American and American history, you talk about how you have this fascination with the spiritual side of violence. And so I thought that was such a really noteworthy statement, because most people just are on the violence, most people are on the history, but there's like a spiritual aspect. And granted, you're host of the Religious War, so I feel like there's some synergy there. But what about the spiritual side of violence fascinates you? Like, and what is that as well? Like, how do you know it?
First of all, I'm a huge history guy. I always have been, right? And when you read any kind of history about war, about conflict, you find that there's always a part in the story where the violence really spirals out of control, especially if we're talking about mass global conflict. But what always interests me as like somebody who's obsessed with religious history, is that when these stories really, really spiral is when God's involved, or there are many gods involved, or whatever. And in a story like Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa and the Shawnee during the early 19th century, that's a story that doesn't really get told in spiritual violence terms, just because it's so material. It's about colonialism. It's about survival. More modern academics might call it, say it's about genocide. It's about these very political things. But when I really dug into this story in particular about Tecumseh, it kind of clicked in for me that this is a spiritual story. This is a story about, this is a massive religious reordering for the Shawnee and a bunch of other native peoples in America at the time. And it's not told that way usually. So I was trying to rectify that. And then spiritual violence writ large. I mean, like, in my opinion, most of the most interesting wars in human history come out of like the biblical era of human history, going way back. And obviously you go back to ancient Rome, ancient Greece. Literally all of the wars are religious wars. Everything in life was part of religious life. But yeah, so going back all the way to, Babylon, Sumeria, whatever, up until Tecumseh and even World War II, whatever, there is this deeply, deeply spiritual side of violence that I think is, historians do a great job showing it, but I'm just trying to really focus on that with my show and my series.
It's really well done. I'm going to say this a lot. I highly recommend this show. Everyone, check it out. He's not paying me for this. He didn't even offer, but he does take the time and energy to make them. It's really good. You capture it. It's like, it is that hardcore history quality show, really in-depth, long, multi-parted for the first part. And I imagine the American Jihad is going to be multi-parted as well. Tecumseh also was a bit of a prophet, right? Like, he was, I don't know if that's a correct term, but like, whenever I think of someone who kind of pioneers their own religion or their own like make of things, I think of, like, I guess Martin Luther's kind of a prophet, though he's not really a prophet. Maybe my own nomenclature doesn't break down, but he's like this, he's a new thing.
So Tecumseh, again, this is another thing where if like when I was in school, we learned about Tecumseh, and it was always Tecumseh, and then the last paragraph in your history textbook would say something like, and he did this in part with his brother, who had a religious movement. So Tecumseh wasn't a prophet. He's a very political leader. But his brother, Tenskwatawa, who has a bunch of different names throughout his life, and like they're a super interesting pair, historically speaking. It's also, Tecumseh is this golden child. It's from birth, more or less. Everybody's super impressed with them. White people who run into the Shawnee write about this, and the Shawnee, they're very nice. Their language is pretty, and there was this incredible boy. Like, people were very interested in Tecumseh, very obviously this amazing guy, but his brother, sort of the opposite. And I'm sure anybody listening can imagine a pair of brothers like that right now, or You have this one who's incredible, and then another one who's, maybe an addict, maybe these other things, because that's what Tenskwatawa was like. He was kind of the runt of the litter in his family, and a drunk, all of these bad things that one day he would fall into a drunken stupor, fall into a coma, and then wake up having this religious awakening. And then he changed his name from, I think it was Lalashiga at the time, to Tenskwatawa. And Tenskwatawa translates into the open door. So Tenskwatawa was this religious figure who doesn't get enough credit these days. Back in the day, they were obsessed with him. He was arguably more famous than Tecumseh in the 1800s, because there was this kind of demon out in the woods changing their religious practices, like their old religious practices. He doesn't even have respect for them, kind of thing. But Tenskwatawa was extremely successful in building this new religious movement. Eventually he would like bring followers to like one town. This town would end up being destroyed by William Henry Harrison, who would go on to become president, all before the War of 1812 started. And this is like Tecumseh kind of came up in this milieu of brother as this big famous prophet. And again, we don't think about it in those terms anymore. Tenskwatawa gets mentioned, if you're lucky, as in the last paragraph of your history textbook, or it's Tecumseh gets this kind of like, yeah, and he did all these things, and also he was doing this religious movement thing. But it was like these two Shawnee brothers who kind of were trying to reorder like the life entirely for a whole race of people. They were trying to reorder the religious assumptions of a group of people, and they were trying to reorder the political assumptions in order to, withstand, I want to say American, but that's not what I mean, white, I guess I could say, kind of encroachment against them. And again, they made this incredible effort, ultimately unsuccessful, of course, but still very interesting.
What was it still animism? I think that's the Native Americans particularly were like the religious beliefs for their animism or shamanism. Was it like that, or what would you describe the tenets of the religious movement and the change as it relates to what they were before?
Yeah, that's what's the one thing that's tough about talking about Native history, generally speaking, is there's a lot of Native histories. And they get very complicated very quickly. There's like big breaks with language groups, and you can say the Algonquins behave this way, and people who speak Creeks, they behave this way. But an Algonquin and a Creek who live next to one another, but don't speak the same language, might be able to interact better than an Algonquin from northern Quebec and versus one from southern Ohio. So it's tough to say that they have these practices all throughout Native society. But what I can talk about with a little bit more authority is like what Tenskwatawa was really trying to do with his religious movement, which was a lot of kind of turning back the clock on what Native societies had changed, the way Native societies had changed since the introduction of like European goods and things like that. So there was a lot of repudiation of guns and wool and things that kind of makes sense they would want to get rid of. But then there was also most Native tribes, again, especially in the East, would carry medicine bags that would have sacred objects in them. And some people think maybe hallucinogenic objects. No one's really sure. They're very secretive about this. Even in between tribes and in between divisions within tribes, this wasn't always necessarily talked about. So it hasn't really come down to us historically speaking. But yeah, getting rid of a lot of really European goods that the natives had used for hundreds of years up to that point, and then kind of getting rid of some of the spiritual practices that natives had kept, that in Tenskwatawa's mind was the demons or the devil or whatever, however miasma, whatever bad force you want to imagine that he was imagining. He was also telling them to get rid of all of their ancient attachments to move forward in this kind of new faith, this new religion where, we are going through the open door, we're going to this new promised land. So it's tough because, again, it's complicated already, and Tenskwatawa's theology was weird. He's a weird guy. It's tough to pin him down, but in general, it was kind of a revival of a bunch of native practices, rejection of ancient ones, and then a repudiation of the settler ways.
It sounds similar to like the death cults of the Camanche in the late 1880s or 1890s that swept through the area. Do you see a simile there, or it feels very similar in terms of like the repudiation and the drive of I think it was like Ishita or Ishitakawa or whatever his name was for the Comanche. I was just reading the Empire of the Summer Moon, so they were talking about death cults, and it feels kind of similar to that.
It's definitely similar. I would to me it has a lot more in common, and I don't like saying this, and I don't like when historians say it, but it has a lot in common with kind of Christianity. There's this kind of end of days feel to it, and he certainly would have been around Christians and been aware of them. And there's also there's a kind of one God vibe without it being the focus. I don't know much about the Comanche stuff. That's with the ghost dance and all that, correct? Yeah. I don't know a ton about that. However, there was a ton of religious weirdness going on in the era I'm talking about. So like late 1790s, early 1800s. Largely because all of the Americans who were here were largely religious weirdos in the first place, and that's what they were doing here. And then these native societies are getting just ripped apart more or less by disease and everything else that comes with a colonial project like the United States. But at the same time as Tenskwatawa, like around the same year, he would have been waking up with his visions and his new way forward. There was another group of Cherokee, I think. It might be, I hope I'm not butchering this, but Cherokee called the Red Sticks. And the Red Sticks were like Tenskwatawa, because Tenskwatawa believed he could do magic. There's a famous story about him stopping an eclipse, or causing an eclipse, all this kind of stuff. But the Red Sticks were a new religious movement, same kind of thing, rejected some parts of the old history, brought in new stuff. But they had this innate belief that they could control the weather, because they had these incursions with white people that would, like, all of a sudden it would start pouring rain and the white people were on a hill and all of their stuff got blown away. And there's these few instances of the weather really, really helping these Red Sticks. And the white people around them started to believe it too, right? Like they had this very powerful aura for, a decade, kind of in, I guess would be like Georgia, like that part of the United States, where people were terrified of the Red Sticks and their ability to control, the earth and the water on the earth. And like these kinds of groups, like Tenskwatawa, again, like they had the belief that he could control the heavenly bodies. They were worried about him. A lot of the Christians didn't think they were real, but they thought they were demons, things like this, right? So these kinds of religious reawakenings that ultimately often spill over into violence were unbelievably common in the United States at the time, especially among Native peoples. And in 1811, what really, really, really kick-started a bunch of weirdness in religion was there was a massive earthquake in the United States. And that really there's Christians writing each other at the time when this happened, accusing other Christians of being earthquake Christians who are only interested in it because they're so terrified of the earthquake. And obviously, like, the earth shaking is going to cause, so there's, at the time in this place, and kind of talking about all throughout the old Western United States, there's a bunch of groups like this changing and reacting to the world around them, and almost all of them are doing it in this really, really, I don't want to say irrational, but really, really faith-based, using faith-based means to react to the world.
Hmm. The period of time looking at natural disasters that affect society, there was also I think it was early 1800s, 1810, 1820, somewhere around there, that we had the summer the year without summer. There was like an asteroid impact or a volcano went off, and we didn't have a summer. Like crops failed. There was famine and stuff. And then from that, Frankenstein was around. So like you have all like it. I think sometimes like nowadays we have like so much science, so much like modernity in terms of how people view themselves, where there's an element of like, oh, I would never fall for that. It's like you have the instant ability to see what's happening. Like there's smog coming down from Canada. I can look at the satellite images and say, oh, there's a forest fire. We're putting it out. Back then, if you're on the frontier and like you have to be like wary of every noise and aware of all these different things. It's so easy. Like go out into the middle of a forest and just sit there for a while. You'll start hearing stuff like that. It's weird. Like just imagine yourself in that position and imagine these things happening, and then you try to make sense of it without the framework that you have now to make sense of it. And then I think it makes more sense to people.
And not only that, like con men was a huge problem in the Old West, where in a lot of them, then as now, there's a ton of religious con men in the world today. But if you're terrified because the community next to you just got ripped apart by some group for some reason, and also the earth is shaking and there's comets in the sky, and you've heard about fires in the big city, a lifetime away from you as far as you're concerned, everything just seems horrible, and then someone comes on a boat and tells you exactly what you need to hear. It's easy to make fun of these old school Americans, especially because it's so, you can see at this point in American history, you can see so much of modern America. Like it's really starting to crystallize, in my opinion. And, if you have any kind of disdain for American politics, which I'm sure everybody listening has some disdain for American politics, you can really start to, see the negatives of the future in this past. But these people are dealing with a lot. That's all I'm trying to say.
In your research, did you ever reach out to like a Shawnee group and or a Cherokee group to hear from straight from the horse's mouth what they thought of these different periods of time? Because I often feel like history is gatekept between the ears of people. Like there's a lot of stuff that doesn't get to go out. And a lot of this period of stuff, I imagine, is from like white settlers documenting it, and then maybe an interview with some Native Americans every now and again. But I'm always curious to just like straight from the source, like what do you as someone from where you're at, it's like, oh, what do you think about this region? It's like you grew up there. Like I think there's something else there. Have you done something like that, or do you have interest in like going down there, like really diving in and hearing straight from like a source that is different?
I definitely wouldn't mind doing something like that in the future. I didn't do anything quite like that for this series, and probably won't until it's concluded, just because that's much more the work of a historian, and I'm not one. I would worry about my methods, or my methodology, I should say, and how appropriate it would be, because I've just never been trained as a historian. I don't know. Like you say, not to gatekeep myself, just to be aware of my own limitations, though. And the other problem is that like the Shawnee it'd be tough for me to talk to the Shawnee. I wouldn't even know exactly who to go to. It's a good question, actually, though. I should consider, because there's got to be some Shawnee historical society, something like that, because like as spot on, bullseye. It's white guys' books I'm reading, generally speaking. And like some of them are excellent, and like as you mentioned, there's so Tecumseh specifically, there's a historian in the 60s and 70s named Benjamin Drake, who is like the reason we know pretty well anything about Tecumseh. and he went around and talked to some of the people in his life and was fascinated by the story, only 2 generations after it ended. And so there's still people alive. And he went and talked to a bunch of living Shawnee who knew Tecumseh. There was a great, really sad, when I say great, quote I remember reading about this era, and Drake was asking this Shawnee elder, like, after you moved from this spot to this spot, was Tecumseh with you then, or did he go with Cheesecat? Or, just asking these specifics of the story. And this elder says to him, we don't remember our stories. They lost when we left Chillicothe, or they were lost when we left Pequot. Whenever our resilience was shattered, we don't know anymore. And that was in the 1860s. Not saying that historians today shouldn't go talk to natives all over the place, and I mean, obviously there's modern native history. Native history isn't over, but for this story in particular, it would have been tough for me to do that, and without the proper training.
Yeah, I hear the wanting to do it the right way, and I also think that give them a voice, even if it was like, I think I see in you the ability to learn the skills, or at the very least, sit down and listen. And I definitely want to have people of Indigenous Americans coming on and just hearing their stories, because I feel like they don't get the voice that they deserve. I'm reading this book. I'm about a third way through it now. It's called 1491. One second. I actually have it pulled up. I'm reading it.
Charles C. Mann.
Yes, which he talks about in the beginning of the book, or like the first third, obviously, but he talks about how there was a tribe that was in South America, who, like, a guy went out there, he visited them, and he saw that they were like living in huts, and they didn't have a culture, they didn't have religion, they didn't have anything, and they was like, oh, this is Paleolithic America, this is what they were like. And so he goes home, and like that's how people get like this noble savage view. That's how, like, that's his proposition for where these things came from. And then people went back, they realized that these people were like refugees from Central America that moved down to this region the time when the Europeans were coming over and attacking the Aztecs, and they're actually like living out in like this bombed out shell of a civilization. Like, you can see the lines. I imagine it like being in Chicago or New York, and everyone's gone, and you don't understand the buildings or the technology anymore, because as you left, the people who knew it died, and they were raised up in this area that they didn't even know it was perfectly lavish and lush. They just were taken advantage of, and they didn't even know. And it's just like this really interesting idea that what if the America suffered essentially like an apocalypse when we came over with the smallpox and all these different things. And so as people are moving in, they not only is there like a cultural difference or religious turmoil that's going on, but they're like first or second, third generations from an earth, like an apocalypse, and so they're living in like a post-apocalyptic world. And then like the frames of reference of like authority and all these other different things have been shattered. So that is a result is why we're getting all these religious fluctuations, this like with the melding of the Europeans colonizing. And I'm that's such a vivid idea. Like, imagine living in a city and you don't even know it's a city anymore because it's been overgrown, because that's where they were then. And so I wondered to what extent like these people in the 1700s to 1800s were still living with the echoes of those scars of like, it's like 8 in 10 Native Americans died.
It depends on how. Well, like, that's a lot of historians now are kind of poo-pooing these figures about how devastating European disease was. I mean, when I say poo-pooing, rather than 8 of 10, they're saying it's 5 or 6, which is still obviously, the Black Death plus. But when we talk about this event in American history, large A America, there were complete apocalypses. Like, there were entire peoples who are gone, who not a single one, no one was left to bury the dead, kind of thing. And when we're talking about even like Americans in the early 1700s during the American Revolution, those people have the far away memory of people who are gone. Like, it's they're rather than like thinking of it as like an apocalypse, I kind of think of it as like a 1,000 apocalypses in a community of 4,000 groups. And then everybody else is still kind of living in that debris, like you say.
Yeah. And then it kind of explains why it was a bit, I wouldn't say easier, but it was like the Native Americans, I mean, the Europeans coming in, they were able to press in pretty strongly and slowly whittle their way through. And I wonder what it would have been like if they didn't have those 1,000 apocalypses, those different peoples, and like what rich tapestry of history is missing. What other religious wars were fought that not a single like shred of recognition exists anymore? Like it's not even like printed into the soil.
There's like but there's tantalizing evidence of those religious wars. So the Shawnee are the Shawnee had this idea that they come from Kentucky. And like at the time they had this idea that we're from that region of America. And it turns out they're probably right by this. Like they just through, you know, ancestral memory, whatever you want to call it. But the Shawnee likely descend or, you know, evolved alongside a group called the Fort Ancient culture, which I'm pretty sure they talk about a little bit in 1491. But the Fort Ancient culture, they built these like incredible cities largely out of like dirt and mud, and but they're huge. These giant mounds, and Native American mounds are all over the United States and Canada, but like in particular this ancient fort. But in some of the underneath some of these mounds, there's bodies buried, and it looks like some kind of execution, but we don't know exactly what happened. And I'm willing to bet, if I was a betting man, that there's something spiritual going on with this whole settlement, but we'll never know anything about it. Mm-hmm. And if there were clues in other mounds, most of those mounds have been destroyed.
Yeah, I was watching a documentary where they were trying to unearth the mounds, like just like archaeologically, and they had this problem where they needed to rush out and put stakes around different sites because the farmers would just try and push them into the rivers. They would try and like destroy evidence of it, because then if they didn't, like they would come in and lose that part of their land. It's like I mean, I understand want to take care of yourself and all these other things, but like I wish there was a way that they could have been compensated so they made money on finding the land versus just destroying and riding over that history, because there's so much that's been lost.
It's tough. It's like you know, just my general ideological bent. I'm always gonna like, but think about the stone tools, you know. That's just how I'm gonna be wired. However, especially if you find like an important site and you are and somehow as a farmer recognize its obvious importance. I don't know that I'd be, if I was a farmer and not a, you know, history book nerd. Maybe my priors were so different. Maybe I would think, okay, go get the backhoe. We just need to take care of this so no one knows about it.
Yeah.
I'd like to think I'd be a bit more ideologically consistent, but who knows?
Yeah, that's why you got to align the incentives. Maybe if there was like a federal structure of like, hey, you find this stuff, well, we can eminent domain certain places. So what if there's a way like you were compensated, like paid as a lease for an archaeological dig to come out there, and it's like you lease the land to someone else to use, and you get the money anyway. Like I feel like if you align incentives, then things work out versus like hoping people do for the best.
Yeah, well, that's like, I don't know much. I've got in the distant horizon, I've got a show on kind of like the deep past that I've been working out, and I actually don't really know that much about like private property archaeology versus, because most of the stuff I read about is land owned by the federal governments of the United States or Canada, or it's UNESCO World Heritage sites in the Near East somewhere. But I know for sure that like there have been major archaeological discoveries that have happened in some guy's backyard. And I'm not exactly sure how that worked then or now.
Yeah, do you I think there's 5 to 7 different theories, I guess hypotheses, on how people came to Americas, and then also like how late in the past can we go before there was like an actual settlement versus like I could see like there being like a like a Lance Armstrong of explorers, just like was like looking around here by themselves. But you're not gonna find that body. That body's gone. You're gonna find the evidence of that, unless you're like Lewis and Clark, who's like peeing mercury or something. The so like a permanent settlement. So okay, two questions here. How early do you think the first permanent settlement was in America? So like when I was a kid, it was like 10. It was like 7 to 10,000. Then it was 20,000. I think there's now evidence to like 50 to 30,000. But I'm curious your thought on that. And then like the follow up question is, do you have a favorite theory for how that settlement came to America? Well, I guess the populating America. Yeah. What's your favorite theory there?
My best guess. I'm glad you noted, because I've noted it too, that like every time the Bering Strait theory comes up, it just gets pushed back 10,000 years or the past 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
My guess is that people were coming to North America, or the landmass around it, for a long time, longer than we suspect.
Yeah.
I've read, I don't know if it's true, but I've read that there's some like possible Denisovan activity like around the Horn of Chile and the very southern tip. That goes back like 100,000 years, and I mean that's not human, but it's a
That's
cousin.
wild, yeah.
And again, I might be talking out of school a little bit with that, but yeah, I suspect that just being travelers and explorers is one of the things that we do. And like, yeah, I think that through the Bering Strait, maybe like, hey, I don't know, maybe through Atlantic sea routes, maybe there was a lot calmer, it was easier. Maybe they fished off a canoe and just survived that 2 months, 3 months, 6 months in a boat. I have a feeling though that like the peoplings of the America, I think in another 10 years it'll probably move back another 10,000 years. And that's all of that stuff is generally just the Bering Strait theory. They're not talking about coming through the Arctic or wherever else, which again, unlikely, but the entire human story is unlikely, right?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I agree with you. I think we're just gonna keep going back and back and back. The humans are explorers. I think it's just in us to do that. My favorite theory for the populating of America is the Kelp Highway. Like we just canoed our way down the side, which is also the hardest one to prove or disprove, because those areas that we would have hugged the shoreline are like now like a mile under water. So all potential evidence, like how do you even do that?
There's a theory from the early 60s, 1960s. I can't remember. This was an anthropologist, not an archaeologist, but he had an idea that the entire world that rims the Pacific Ocean was all one culture in deep into ancient past. And I know it kind of, you got to be careful when you talk about the ancient past, generally speaking, because you start getting into Graham Hancock territory when you're talking this way about one culture over, I don't know, 40,000 miles or something like that. This giant mega culture that he describes, but like is the same idea that people just kind of went around this giant ring up to North America from Japan and the Indonesia, kind of wrapping around the entire Pacific Ocean. Like the way the Mediterranean Sea was for the Romans, the Pacific Ocean was just this giant kind of uncrossable but thing you would follow along in the deep Neolithic world. I don't know if that's like a widely accepted theory among anthropologists or historians or anybody, but it's still super fascinating.
It's interesting. It's an interesting thought experiment at the very least. I find it unlikely that there'd be like a monoculture. Just even in our conversation, you have like a Shawnee not knowing what a sister Shawnee or tribe would have in their medicine pack, and that's like geographically maybe like a 5 square mile, 10 square mile area, and we're talking a region that could sink China repeatedly in it and still not see the tips. Like it's a massive spot. So I would think that like the definitely like some layering there of different cultures.
For sure. And I think like the quote I remember reading from The Dawn of Everything was he had discovered a like very ancient stone tool in British Columbia, I think, or the Pacific Northwest somewhere, and like some kind of stone axe. And his quote to his assistant was, "Now I know exactly what the stone axes in China look like." Which, I mean, there's only so many ways to turn a stone into an axe, and the relationship between the material culture and like the actual culture is interesting to ponder. But it's still, I do like thinking about the world of the deep past as a kind of like the world now. Just everything's slower and simpler, but there's still massive connections over great distances.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, we're the same type of people. Like, there's been genetic mutations to make our brains a little bit smaller and more faster, like better myelin sheath and all these different things. So I think in that period of time, our brains have decreased by about the size of a lemon. But fundamentally, the people of 100,000 years ago had the same capacity for things as we do today. I think if you grabbed one and raised it today, it'd probably do just as well as any other average human. So like, I think that's a big thing as well. It's like it wasn't a different species 100,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago. So if you had like 100,000 people doing something, they're going to do something very well. Like at a certain point, people just start building pyramids or building things.
Yeah.
But
That's a super interesting question of like when the first human was. Like there's the anthropologists break it down now by like the difference between anatomically modern, which that goes way back 300,000, maybe even longer. It could be half a million years for all we know. But we also have like behaviorally modern to describe, because I agree with you totally that 100,000 years ago we're the same animal, but in the archaeological record, at a point 50,000 years ago, we started to act real different from the stuff we would leave behind. And like that's the anatomic or behaviorally modern humans. Like if you want hard evidence for the earliest human beings, the deepest we can go back is 50,000 years, because those are our oldest like cave paintings and things like that, where we're doing things that are recognizably human and rather than hominid.
Yeah. It's something that I love about I love this about cave paintings. Wherever it is on the planet, the one thing you'll always see, or typically will see, is a hand and a stencil around it. And I think everyone listening, when they were a kid, drew their hand with a stencil around it. And I feel like we didn't, like, no one was like, oh, let's copy the cave painting people. There's just something human about putting your hand on a wall and like tracing it to say I was here. I love that. I love that
into the world.
Yeah, and I think that's really beautiful. And I wonder, to the extent it's like it's a population of humans. Like, what if it's like if there's like 1,000 or 2 of us around, like we do all right. We still get eaten by lions, but when there's like a certain population of people in a region, then we start building up and doing other things. Because at certain points in our history, I think pre 50,000 years ago, there wasn't that many of us around. Like we kept having these bottlenecks of droughts and these things that kept almost wiping us out. Actually, I wonder to the extent that the ability to this curiosity, this earning to, as like Carl Sagan and Herman Melville and like Moby Dick say, like to sail forbidden seas, these unknown areas, came from these droughts, these things that were like whittled down people to be only the ones that were willing to explore and go new areas so that they would be more drought resistant as a species. I wonder if the thing that really changed wasn't so much a cultural, which I think the thing before the culture was a population thing. Like the population had to be of a certain size and dynamic enough where then the different culture could then emerge. It's the difference between like these people that were found in South America living in the shell of a civilization that didn't have the mass to sustain themselves. Like over like 40 years, they went from like 2,000 like 50 people. So like there's something there that they weren't even sustaining themselves. That I wonder if like the population is the thing that allowed the rest to come after it. And like that's like the watershed moment.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about population in terms, especially like these like the genie's out of the bottle in terms of population. It'd be kind of tough to mitigate the population of the earth in any meaningful way now, but it's interesting to think about like in North America. So like the Shawnee, for example, there were different native groups who liked bigger cities, who liked larger populations, for all of the reasons we like larger populations, safety, etc. But at the same time, I think what a lot of people do not accusing you of this at all, but like what a
Mhm.
lot of people do when they talk about, recent native peoples in the United States, or going all the way back to someone camping out on an island in the Bering Strait. uh I think a lot of these people have decision making abilities, and it is,
Yeah.
and a lot of, like, I'm sure most of it is resources and following animals and blah 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 blah. But I think that there may have been a time where, like, the Shawnee at some point decided they didn't want to live in the Fort Ancient culture anymore. And
Mhm.
the Fort Ancient culture was like very recognizably a city state. It had its big area and then little areas around it that seemed certainly under its control and influence. But eventually they thought that's a bad idea for one reason or another. And maybe it was just a drought, or, you know, the an earthquake, who knows. But I do think that it's easy to take agency away from people when we're reading about them and their actions,
Mhm.
instead of giving them the idea that, like, giving them the ability to have the idea that they want to live a certain way and therefore
Mhm.
enacting on it. And ultimately, I think, like, if we're talking about behaviorally modern humans versus anatomically modern or whatever, I do think that's like the ultimate distinguishing factor in what a human being actually is that we can, recognize our surroundings and make choices to change them.
Mhm. I wonder how we'd be able to study that as we move back in the past with limited evidence to differentiate. Because
There's an idea called schismogenesis. It's in anthropology circles, where if you find a settlement, like a Neolithic settlement, you're likely to find a settlement over a river, or where a river once was, um, that behaves very different than that previous settlement on
Mhm.
purpose.
That's
Uh,
interesting.
then the idea is that, like, human beings relate to each other and we copy from one another, but also we see how other people live and decide we don't want that at all. So
Mhm.
you might have, there's famous examples in the western United States of, like, kind of in southern British Columbia. The people there used to have these very kind of authoritarian power structures, very hierarchical, big parties, all this kind of stuff. And then you get into Washington and even up to northern California. The people there, they have a lot more of an egalitarian structure, but everything's a lot more like the uh some writers have called them, like, American Protestants
Mhm.
before Columbus, because they had this kind of sober, sensible work ethic, etc. And, like, in likely those two very aware of one another's existence and define themselves against each other.
Mhm.
So I think that's what I was kind of,
That's
again,
interesting.
like you say, it's tough to study, but that, like,
Yeah.
schismogenesis is something that anthropologists are aware of.
Mhm. That's interesting because inherently you get two people together and they consider themselves an us, and then like make something else to them. I think that's just like a human nature, like us together, like people for like working together every day. Like only takes two people to have like an in and out group, is what I'm trying to say. So
Yeah.
I could see how easily there would be like, hey, we're this group. We don't do what this group does. We do our own thing, and then like over time, there's this great study of monkeys who were they were brought in, and there was like some bananas on the top of a pedestal, and with the ladder, if you could go up there, eat them, they love the bananas. But if you went up there, they'd hose you. So like get up there, you get shot off, and they're like, oh, don't do that. So whenever someone were to come up, they would stop them from going to it. So they started removing the monkeys that ever were hosed to the bananas, and then it eventually got to the point where only monkeys were there that were trained not to go up there, and they were still reinforcing the new monkeys to not go up the ladder and grab the bananas. And so
Yeah.
there's this element of like the people who made the change, who understand why the change happened, were gone, but the change of like these people do something differently, we do this differently, is there and now being held together by the preceding generations. So it's very like innate, at least like a great ape type feature in people or for
Yeah,
great
no,
apes.
for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
It's like the banana study is always interesting to me because, like, there's this kind of human supremacy, you might say, idea where we're like, yeah, those monkeys, they don't even know why they're not climbing the ladder, and it's just like, well, yeah, but they don't really need to because they'll get
Yeah.
hosed. That's kind of what culture is in a lot of ways, right?
Yeah. I think there's elements of that in human society all over the place. I think anyone sitting down and start like going through their day and asking why I do this, why I do this, why I do this, and asking at a certain point you'll be like, I don't know, I was just kind of told to do this. I was just kind
Yeah.
of told. Yeah, and there's like, for some things, like I was told to look both ways before crossing the street. There's a survivorship bias, and like the people who didn't got ran over by cars. But but yeah, the one thing that I like about the Shawnee and that region of time, it's interesting. I seriously, I love the fact that you look at it from the spiritual religious aspect, because it's one that doesn't innately come to me, but I see the value of it. They had different government structures. There was like the Confederacy that I think Tecumseh either like came into or like helped form. Like they grabbed a bunch of tribes together. Like there were different. I think there's this element like that people thought either that all tribes were or one tribe. So if you're talking to one, you're talking to all of them. That was like we've talked about. Like that's not true. Like they were
No.
many differentiating factors. But also this idea that, or they're like so individualistic that they never work together. And so I love the Confederacy as this like little microcosm of their own form of government. Now I have a Hamilton song stuck in my head, but the what do you think about the Confederacy, or like the system of government that they used to like lash together to make the change that they wanted to have in the world?
Yeah, like so the Iroquois Confederacy, or the more popular name now, Hodinoshoni Confederacy, I think doesn't get enough credit in its role in like American history. I think that the founding fathers were very aware of like that. It's a political organization that might maybe older than the Roman Empire for all we know. Like it's in some iteration or form. And like, yeah, the Iroquois, the reason Iroquois has fallen out, just a quick aside, the reason Iroquois has fallen out of favor is because Iroquois is an Algonquin word. I might be confusing this, but it's their enemies language group. And it means savage killer. so to call these people Iroquois is it'd be like calling all Canadians dumb Canucks or something like that. But yeah, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, that's its own crazy, interesting political body that I recommend anybody look up how it works, as I'm going to butcher it, but like they would have these different groups within the Confederacy would come together and they would argue and debate over council fires and then move around the council house in order to determine what to do. It's very much a parliament.
It was. I love this. If I'm remembering it right, the simplicity of their design was the like. I think it was like the two biggest groups had to agree first. Like everything was like grouped in tuples, in two pairs, and so two groups had to agree on it. But then it would go to the next group, and if they didn't agree on it, it would go back to the beginning. But if they did agree on it, go to the next. And so for I think the biggest groups were first, so that like all the little groups couldn't be like divided and conquered to agree with them and like pitted against each other, like to have like some type of like civil war go on. So like the way it was set up was that you already knew what everyone else thought, and it was so well debated at each stage that by the time the conclusion came, like it had a consensus that was kind of like locked in. There was such a strong bias towards like moving forward because people were like kind of tired of it. But I like that system of like marrying the biggest, like the two biggest, like people, like not bullies, but like two biggest kids that are most likely to fight people together, and have them lock out and work out their problems before the other people have to like be forced to choose sides. And now it's just like they're all on the same side working, and then everyone else gets their voice heard. I think that's the Haudenosaunee Confederacy that we're talking about.
Yeah, definitely. And like they were like, I don't, I think a lot of times when you cover Native history in North America, you can get into this kind of self-flagellation because like we're both settlers, etc., right? But I do think, while trying to avoid that and like, oh, we just ruined this beautiful, the Garden of Eden, and we came here and shit all over it kind of stuff, I do think it is very interesting how we've been able to, in our own minds, like Right. The native people, like the Hodinoshoni, they didn't have gunpowder or cannons or anything like that. But they also didn't have a king. They had like a kind of representative. You couldn't call it democracy, but they would have thought democracy was the dumbest thing they'd ever heard about, right? Like they had a representative form of government that was all about debating ideas. And like now in today's in our world as settlers, we would think of having a king as something that's kind of backward. And if you do have a king, it's someone who's in this kind of ceremonial position. And unless it's, Saudi Arabia or some country that no one wouldn't call it backwards, but I would say most Westerners might call that idea less politically evolved.
Mhm.
But at the time, when they got here, when Europeans saw this Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and most of them didn't care at all, but when the missionaries and stuff did want to learn these things, what was their reaction to this political body that debated ideas? Well, this is backward pagan nonsense. If you want to do something, you need your god king.
Mhm.
And still I feel like we haven't really, as a culture, recognized what we took, not just in terms of land and like more obvious like lives of their tribal members, but it wasn't just the Romans who were doing politics before Europeans.
Mhm.
There's a large political bodies here that were, I would argue, a lot more rational and more enlightened even than what was happening in Europe when the Europeans came here. But it's never discussed that way. It's always kind of, well, that's great politics we're going to do, but we're just going to blast you in the face with our blunderbuss, and that's kind of the
Mhm.
beginning and end of the story.
Yeah, I often wonder what all did the American framers have at the ready to think about how to frame democracy as it moved forward? Because like people think now, like, oh well, they had all these things. Like, not really. They had like Athens, Rome. But if you look at the structure that America came out with, there was really there's no like one to one. Like they invented a lot of weird stuff, and they like they cobbled stuff together. So I do wonder what
No, yeah.
credit, what like debt of credit do the Native Americans deserve to have in our history for how they influenced how we framed our government.
More than you think, I would say. Probably even more than I think.
Mm-hmm.
There's in the like very early days of American colonialism, there was a missionary, a group of missionaries who talked to I think he was an Algonquin leader named Candiaronk, and that's what they called him.
Mm-hmm.
And for a long time, everybody in the kind of educated world of Europe and settler America, etc., they had the idea that Candiaronk was an invention. This idea that these missionaries would go talk to native people, and they would invent a native person to kind of put their own ideas in this native person's mouth as a way to critique their society, because they couldn't critique their society. More modern historians now see some evidence that Candiaronk was a real person, and he even traveled to France. And we're talking like the 1640s and 50s, and likely took place in salons and stuff. And what was he talking about in these salons? Well, representative government, um, the rights of the individual. It would be a little bit much to say that the European Enlightenment started because of natives, Native Americans. But I also think that like Candiaronk as a figure will probably become more popular as time goes on. And also I think it's just like, not putting on my university buzzwords or anything, but white supremacy, colonial mindset, where people assume this was fake. And frankly, I don't think most people want to hear it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
That our intellectual tradition we live with doesn't come from Athens and Rome, but like maybe our government structure does, but the ideas about
Mm-hmm.
what makes an enlightened society actually enlightened, I think we owe a lot more to North America than than we pretend we do.
Yeah, I think the ideas are viruses. They spread, especially if there's something innate in them that is true and people are already reaching for them anyway. I think there was a study on this, and I always hate bringing it up, but I'm fine with it because the population isn't of high school and younger age for the show. But for instance, suicide, when there's one suicide in a school, they found that you have to like come in with like a ton of help, like a ton of counselors, ton of like all support, because if you leave it alone, you'll have like just a wave of suicides after that.
Yeah,
because it's now in the zeitgeist, it's now like permeated as like, oh, that's something I could do. It really affects people. So I could see this person going out there and start spreading like, hey, what if people were first? You're not happy with your king, and like you started doing all these different things, and it hit something true in them that they were already working through with the not the Renaissance. Was it the Renaissance? No, it's not the Renaissance. There's like a different period. The Enlightenment. Thank you very much. Like they're already searching for these ideals. So I wonder if like I could totally see them this person coming in and having just this formulation of a solution that just slots in and starts running, and people don't even know. It's like when you have a conversation and 40 minutes online, it's like, how did we get here? But it all came from something. And so
even more than not knowing, but actively like maybe not actively concealing it, but purposely concealing it in some way where no one in an extremely xenophobic racist society is going to listen to in France is going to listen to an English person about what they should do.
Yeah.
let alone someone from a world away. It's with all of these other aggravating factors, right?
Yeah, one of the just this disgusting example from the 1491 book is how I think there's like the Taino Indians went from like 5 million to like 5,000 people over the course of like a generation because they were just worked to death. And there was a person who wrote about it, but he wouldn't let people publish it for like post him dying, but then it got kind of lost and it didn't come out until like 1900s. But like they were so concerned about the backlash of saying certain things that they like squash it themselves. And so I could imagine someone in France saying like, hey, I have this idea, but if I say it's these people, they're not gonna take it seriously, so I have to kind of say it's my idea. So like unintentionally they're like forming into the system. It's kind of like I don't know what that, like I look at themes or like patterns that seem to like prevail in humans, and one thing that seems to happen is like when there's a value in one system that goes to a different system, whichever system has the determinant value. So like in ancient times, Romans really valued silver, and they had a lot of stuff to buy with silver, and so they would go to India, and India was like, I don't give a shit about silver. You want silver? We want these other things. And so, but at a certain point, the Indians started seeing silver on the same weight as the Romans because they were forced to see it in the same light, so they weren't taken advantage of. And so I wonder to the extent that like ideas are the same way. It's like they didn't the dominant class of like these like white nationalism, not white national, like white colonial type ideas of like, hey, we can't give credit to these people, like they're less than or whatever. If they cited them, it wouldn't have worked. But if they believe that the silver of like, hey, we are great and they came from me, then we have everything that happened in France. Then it kind of like dominoes over to the Americas and everywhere else. It's like the reason why that would work. It seems like a structure that keeps repeating throughout time and history.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and I just it doesn't like as a historical pattern, the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, etc., don't make sense as European phenomenons, and in fact they aren't, because they come from the ancient world of the Far East and Near East. And I mean, if you want to call Rome European, you can, but like it's you know what I'm getting at here. But like yeah, like I think that the North American connection is only recently been discovered, really, and like and is still not at all understood. But I personally believe it's there. And I mean, again, this the Candy Aronk story comes from a book called The Dawn of Everything by David Wengrove, and I forget the co-author's name right now, but if you like 1491, you'll love The Dawn of Everything.
Yeah, I was literally deciding between asking for book recommendations and like moving on to a different topic. So like, let's dive into that. I need more books on this subject. I'm reading I'm reading anthropological journal publications from like they're really quite anemic. Like they're very they're boring, but the information's there. So if there's like a consolidation like 1491, or that has like a nice flavor of something there, what books would you recommend? So I'm definitely I'm gonna buy this one later. But what other books would you recommend?
Since we're on Tecumseh, the book that I kind of that like really set the tent poles in my series is a book, Tecumseh and the Prophet, the Shawnee Brothers Who Defied a Nation. Probably the best book on Tecumseh ever, has the benefit of being the most recent book on Tecumseh. It came out in 2019. But it's very good. The Dawn of Everything. It's like I read that fairly recently, but like that book really changed my perspective on just about everything I think about the ancient world, like the ancient past, the deep history. If we're staying on that, I feel like we're in a kind of, Neolithic mood at the moment. There's a book called there's an author called Ian Hodder, who he's an anthropologist archaeologist, who is the project lead at Catalhoyuk, if you're familiar.
Never heard that before.
It's a very important, well-known Neolithic site somewhere in I think Turkey. It's kind of it's near the antiquity of like Göbekli Tepe.
Okay, yeah, the Graham Norton areas that he doesn't shut up about.
He doesn't shut up about him, but he very rarely says anything worth saying. Ian Hodder is the, if you want to go for the decidedly gate-kept academic big archaeology side of stories, but he also had a great book about why the agricultural revolution happened, why we aren't nomadic peoples anymore, to kind of spoil all of that real quick, that whole book into a one sentence, rather than it has to do with, well, we recognize that we got this many more calories farming, or we'd have this many more people. His idea is that we started to farm and to have a sedentary lifestyle because we started to accumulate too much stuff to move around with. And I love that idea of, in archaeology, they call it like this stuff, you have your material history. And I love the idea that we have all of these fantastical imaginings for how smart we are and all this stuff. And it's like, no. We fundamentally changed what it meant to be an animal on planet Earth for our species because we had too many knickknacks and tools and cooking stones and drinking vessels and all of this stuff that kind of defines modern life, especially, but had all of this stuff weigh us down and keep us in one spot versus, the genius of farming or other human genius is a lot more, we're pack rats and can't help it.
I'll have to read it. My favorite teacher in high school, his name was Woodhelm, I think. I always called him Wild Ham, so I kind of see him as that my name. He did not like it, but it was an agriculture class, and he said his thing is agriculture is because we're lazy. We just got to the point where it's like, well, I have to go hunting, or I can go like keep that in a pen and then eat it. It's like, I like the hypothesis, but I'm definitely going to look at that one with open eyes to see if maybe it's because we're pack rats, which does have an element of laziness too. Like you get tired of carrying it.
Definitely. And I mean, again, that's the bastardization and kind of what I took from it. And Ian Hodder is an incredible thinker. That's a preeminent archaeologist, certainly of the Near East, maybe ever. like very smart guy. A book definitely worth your time.
Is he alive, or is he like an ancient guy?
He's alive. I think he's in his 70s. He's retired. He I don't know if he does podcasts. I've looked into it briefly, but like, oh boy, would I listen to that one, heartbeat.
Yeah. Well, I'll see if I can get him on the show after reading a couple of his books. It sounds fun. For yourself, do you intend to do like a Mike Duncan History of Rome type guy where he's now writing books too? I could see much of what you're talking about being consolidated into a powerful book like Storm Before the Storms or the Man of Two Worlds, Lafayette. Like
I appreciate the vote of confidence. Yeah, you know what? Maybe my background's in writing. Writing's my first love, in particular nonfiction. But yeah, it's no one's banging on my door giving me a book deal, but it's definitely something I've thought about before. I mean, thought about before. Listen, I have like 30 book drafts open at any given time that I'm throwing ideas at, but it's never something I pursued super seriously.
Yeah.
Maybe one day.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to read a draft. I think you have something here that people don't normally cover, and I think it'd be great to see it out in the world. After, so you've covered the Maccabees, you're covering Tecumseh. Can we get a hint? What would be like another area? Are you going to be in the Americas? Is there like
my next story is we're going back to the ancient world. So this Tecumseh, it's going to take me a while, probably about a year of coming out with shows, just because it's a big story. It's probably 4 or 5 parts. But after that, there's a character called Alexander of Abonotatus in the ancient Roman world, who was a healer. He started a snake cult.
Who hasn't?
And the crux of the story is we know a little bit about this guy from archaeology because of his cult. Coin. He had coins made with his face on it, and his Glycon, this snake god that he worshipped. And Glycon was a real snake that could talk, if you believe the stories. And there's like real Roman citizens who we know when we have their correspondence who said like, yes, and I was in Abonotatus, and I saw Alexander and his oracle Glycon, and it was fine. They see this talking snake and they think, whatever. For a long time, most people assume though that this Alexander of Abonotatus guy was a kind of invention, but eventually they discovered the works of Lucian, who's this ancient writer, very cool guy. I highly recommend the works of Lucian for anybody who likes reading ancient authors. But Lucian writes this whole account of his life, and Lucian hates Alexander, hates him with a passion. I read somewhere that he actually owed him money and all this stuff. Like, I wasn't able to confirm that, but
that's funny.
Yeah, but so you have this life story of this guy, and who effectively is doing magic tricks and fooling people that way. And magic is something I would only share with you and whoever may be listening that deeply in love with magic, always was when I was a kid. So I was just fascinated on like, here's a story of this guy, and like Lucy would go through, and this is how he did it, and he has a tube through the egg and all this kind of stuff. So that's the story I'm focusing on, and kind of the tension between the world who doesn't know a lot about this guy, and then the only source we have for learning about him hating his guts with a deep passion. And I also, like the spiritual side of violence, there's always these kind like quacks and liars who always do this in a religious sense. You can even make the case that Tenskwatawa is one of those people. Certainly the Red Sticks would have said that about Tenskwatawa, as would white folks. But yeah, that's what I've got in the pipeline that's coming out whenever this is done. And then after that, I got a big epic planned on prehistory.
Sweet. Well, you have a subscriber in me, and I look forward to all of it. So ending on a fun topic, Graham Hancock and Zachariah Sitchin. I don't know Zachariah Sitchin. I was just like pulled this because I was reading through tweets. Zachariah.
Yeah.
I don't know if they're contemporaries in the sense of like how they think, but what do you think about if you had? I don't know how to ask this question other than just saying like, do you think Graham Hancock is a piece of shit? Like, is he full of shit? I think that the idea that there's like coevolution of concepts is not inherently saying that there's like a massive civilization. Is like my critique. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, what I like about Graham Hancock, let's start there. It like legitimately though, like they're I think I became aware of him years ago, like many people did through the Joe Rogan podcast.
Same.
And there was a bunch of stuff on there I learned about for the first time. I before Ancient People, I might have heard about first from Graham Hancock. Gobekli Tepe I was aware of before that, but like that's what I like about him is that there's parts of history that are super not well known, and he would bring some. I like Gobekli Tepe, I'd argue pretty famous now. I don't think it's because of Max Schwartz, I think was the archaeologist on that site. I think it's famous because of Graham Hancock and his stuff about it. And like that said, I don't mind people going crazy with far out there theories about the past. I mean, just now when I was talking about, hey, what really started the Enlightenment natives. A lot of people could say that that's its own kind of very far out there theory. But I would leave it to the discernment of your audience if those things are equivalent. But what I dislike about Graham Hancock is you just make stuff up, and a lot of it stems, or if it's not made up, it's just not true, or like patently false, like easily disprovable. And a lot of times the origins of those falsehoods are just racist lies, so I think there's that said, I don't think Graham Hancock is this evil, horrible guy. I do think he's, has an interesting relationship with the truth. I don't think he's a vicious racist. But ultimately, a lot of where his ideas come from are like, a disciple of Himmler. And like without ever bringing that up, it's just odd, And of course, there's this ancient group of people who are trying to communicate with us, and I was like, well, which group are they? That said, though, if it's largely harmless, Graham Hancock. And like I've friends who are archaeologists and have podcasts and stuff, and like they hate him with the passion, and I don't blame them. I would probably hate him a lot more if I was a professional. But I also think that like some of the Atlantis and excuse me, the Atlantis as a kind of Nazi myth stuff, I think archaeologists like to blow that side up of pseudo archaeology, because then they're not fighting a guy who's much more famous and much richer than them with his pseudoscience. They're Indiana Jones. They're fighting Nazis. And I think the academic community can blow that side up of Graham Hancock a little bit too. That said, if it's something you like, and it's it's no worse than in most like made for TV documentaries. Well, it's worse, but like not too much worse. What's your opinion of him? I've been monologuing here without.
Yeah, I don't think you've been monologuing in my opinion. I like what you've been saying. My feeling, I agree with you. He does like he's bringing up ideas that would, I think, normally be left to the wayside. Similar to Joe Rogan, a lot of people give him shit, but he also brings up things that are worth discussing. And I know sometimes people are like, "Oh, do you engage with these weird ideas or not?" It's like you don't know what a weird idea is until after you engage in it. Like there are times where we thought for the longest time, anything past 12,000 years, you're an idiot.
Yeah. Well, now, for sure.
Yeah, I think there's an element of like have an idea, but then be open to changing the data. I watched his documentary that he had on Netflix. I thought it was kind of like I thought there was something there, but it's like he would look at something and he would like start saying something, or he would just go in a direction that I didn't feel was true. Like when I looked at the evidence that he's like then making conclusions from, there were just times where it just didn't feel right. It didn't like resonate with me. So I feel like he's like the foundation of what he's saying. Like there are things to see, but but there are times where it just doesn't feel like, and that's just a feeling. Like I'm not gathering data conclusions effectively either, but sometimes it does feel like his conclusions are not, they don't jive with how I feel things would be. But then again, I'm just a random guy, and he has his. Then we're just having like an opinion battle. So I like it and I dislike it too for those reasons.
I have a friend who has a podcast about Ancient Aliens, the TV show, and Graham Hancock is the regular on that program. But I always thought about Ancient Aliens that if you could strategically hit the pause or the mute button, you could get a halfway normal historical education about something, because a sentence from Ancient Aliens might be like myth says that the founding fathers signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776, but actually the document was signed over a several month period in various different places. But what if aliens? And it's just like, if you had that pause, if you had a fast enough trigger pull, and you could hit that pause button just when you heard the word "but," you could watch that show and learn something.
Yeah.
And I haven't seen Ancient Apocalypse, but I have a feeling there's a kind of similar. They're spiritually similar in that way. In that, like, I know he goes to the Fort Ancient burial mound in that show, and I'm sure he gives you a bunch of great information about it. And then he goes off to La La Land, where in resonance building and whatever he's talking about, right? So that's where, the Ancient Aliens, there's a bunch of stuff on that show that, like, the historical events that if you didn't know anything about, it would be really interesting to learn about. But also, if the only thing you know about it is aliens did it, or this ancient peoples, from Atlantis did it, well, then you really don't know anything about it still.
Yeah. I would just like to believe in the indomitable will of humans, I guess. And then if there's aliens helping out, that's neat too, I guess, in their own, in some little way.
If you don't believe in the indomitable will of humans, it will find you and it will make you believe.
Yeah. Go watch Rudy and then come back. But so where I was watching Rudy with my best friend, and in the beginning she was like, I don't like sports movies a little. Why am I doing this? Like, you owe me. I watched freaking your movie last week. It's my turn to pick. And everyone else was fine with it, but she was like, giving me a little shit, which is fine. But like by the end of it, she was like crying, like Rudy. Yeah. So like it gets you. But where can people stay up to date with what you're working on? You have a bunch of series coming up. You have good stuff out now. Where can we go to never miss a single bit of it?
Well, you can subscribe to Religious Wars wherever you get your podcasts. That would be the best thing to do. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Erik ERIK01. I don't tweet very much, but occasionally I'll throw something out there. And those subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcast. That's the best thing to do. And keep a lookout.
Sweet. Well, all that will be in the show notes as well for people who are on the go. Just come back, look at them, you can click them out. Erik, I want to thank you so much for spending so much time talking about this fascinating subject that I don't think people talk about enough, and having your own unique bend on this. I look forward to your first book and your next series. Thank you for coming on the show today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on. Big fan.